I'm Todd. I see a few new faces out there. I'm the lead pastor here at Cornerstone, and if you're new here, just wanted to say welcome. We're glad that you're here. One of our hopes is this Jesus that we've been singing about all morning, that you would encounter him today if you don't already know him. All of us in here, we're passionate about Jesus. We're passionate about who he is, what he did, who he claims to be, and even one day who he will be, and that is this one who will return to let the whole world know that he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so that's who we hope you encounter today. But we've been in the book of Jonah. And for most of you, whether you grew up in the church or didn't grow up in the church, you probably know who this Jonah cat is. And most likely you've kind of associated Jonah with a whale. Now, for those of you that are theologically astute, you realize it's not a whale, it's a fish. And so I appreciate just your theological astuteness, and so we'll kind of work on that a little bit today. But in it, I think one of the things that's really important as we look through this particular story is I feel like many times as we look at the miracle, the reality of a man who gets swallowed by a whale that gets out onto the shore, I think one of the things that we miss is something that God is, I think, really trying to teach us out of the book of Jonah. And so I don't want to deny that miracle. I believe it's absolutely true. I know there's some that don't, and they kind of see this as a little bit of a political satire in some way. I think this really did happen, but I think, again, we can miss the point of what's going on. Now, what we're going to do is we're looking at this storyline, and in this storyline, it's kind of following two major themes, which is the first one, which is Jonah's this man who's been greatly hurt by another group of people. We're talking about the Ninevites. They have greatly hurt him, and they've hurt the Israelite people. So there's kind of what Jonah does. There's a lot of baggage. It's more complex sometimes than I think we realize. But it has moved him from hurt to a guy, you really see this in him. He's racist. He wants nothing to do. In fact, he is so angry at this group of people that he is willing to run from God in order to not deal with them. That's the racism that's built up in his heart just from years and years of not dealing with that anger and that hurt. What's so great about this story is that God's going to deal with this particular thing, though, in his life. Don't miss this. As God sometimes works on this global scheme of things and accomplishing all his business, don't forget he is individual in how he's going to seek to accomplish it. Now, I think also when we study the book of Jonah, we need to put it in its larger context inside of what are called the minor prophets, which are basically telling this story about how God is dealing with his people, Israel. It's in the grander scheme, we're also talking about Israel. This story is a reflection on the people of Israel who are also at this particular spot. But I think when we look at God, the thing we realize is that it's a message of good news about the wideness of God's love and mercy, even towards enemies. This is how huge and wide the love of God is. And I think, again, sometimes we get caught up in the miracle and we miss this God who has a heart, not just for Jonah and not just for his people, but this heart even for this group of people that are despised, this group of people that have done awful things to the people of Israel. Now, last week what we learned, though, is it's a story also about running away. Not like a hobo, right, that's sitting there running away with his little satchel on his back. I think it's a little bit bigger than a bindle. He's talking about, I think, specifically this idea that there's this God who no matter who we are or what we do, we can't run from him. That was the very last point that we had in there. We can try to run from God, but we can't outrun God. And the thing we learned last week is the reason we can't outrun him is no matter where we get, he's already there. You can't outrun a God that's everywhere. But yet in this particular instance, he ran. Now, we've learned in kind of the way that Jonah writes this particular book, he ends abruptly. So it's not just about Jonah, and it's not just about the people of Israel. He's also now specifically, and I think the reason it ends the way it does is to get it to realize, I am in some ways Jonah. Everybody in here, I don't care who we are, we run. Now, some of you are running from this, in this particular instance, you're running because you are just outright, you want nothing to do with him, and you know you want nothing to do with him. In fact, you're probably sitting here, why in the world am I even in this room today? Did I just come because I made my wife happy, my husband happy, my kids happy? Why am I even here? And I think you're actually here for a reason, because in some ways, I think you're running from God. Now, in some ways, when we talk about running from God, sometimes it's just we're outright opposed to him. For some of you in here, you're high school students. When I was a high school pastor, I always used to hear this. You know, I'm just going to kind of not deal with God right now until later after I've had a little bit of fun. And after I've had a little bit of fun, then I'll come back to God. Okay? Then I also dealt with college students. College students are interesting. I kind of don't have time for God right now. I'm kind of putting God over here for a little bit. But you know what? After I get my degree, and after I've got my kicking hot spouse, and after I've got my 2.5 kids, and my perfect house, and my this and my that, then I'll deal with God. I think that it could even be something serious, like a woman who, in a lot of ways, is not receiving affection from her husband. So she thinks in her head, this guy that sees me at the gym, it's kind of worth it to kind of go over here, and I'm going to outrightly be defiant against God, and I'll just deal with some of it later. It could even be some of you that are climbing the corporate ladder inside of business. You know what? Right now, I don't have time to run with God, to be with God. I'm going to run away, but don't worry, I'll come back. Sometimes it's just flat out overt, and some of you have never even encountered this God. You've been running your whole life, and I think the reason that you're here today, whether you know it or not, is you're here today to encounter this God that Jonah encountered, and so that's why I'm excited that you're here today. But then there's others of us. Maybe for you, you're not really outrightly running from God. You're not someone kind of doing your own thing. It's not that you're kind of out stealing lollipops from babies, right? You're not killing kittens. But in a weird way, you know that you've started to kind of coast in your walk with Jesus. You're coasting in all kinds of different ways. You've coasted and kind of are getting caught up in innocent things. You've gotten comfortable kind of with being frustrated and even hating your spouse. You can't remember the last time you spent quality time with God or His Word or His people. You've settled into life. You're enjoying it without any regard to kind of His call, His mission in your life. You used to be in some ways probably even, and I think I see this a lot, you used to be a spiritual superstar back in college in like Campus Crusade or one of these other groups, but you've just started to drift. It's a little bit more covert. See, I think this is why the book of Jonah is for all of us. It gets into, and it kind of gets into these little crevices in our life, and it reminds us we all in these different ways begin to run from God. But you know this, and I know this. Those times, where we're laying on our bed at night, and we're staring at the ceiling, and nobody else is with us other than our thoughts with God. And we know right now things with me and God are not going well. Shoot, things with me and me aren't even going well. You know there's going to be a reckoning point where there's going to be time where you're not going to be able to avoid it anymore. Eventually you're going to tire from running. You're going to hit the wall. You're going to end up in a fish. You look around at the others, and even this either overt sin that you're committing or this covert sin, you can just see that it's starting to harm your family, your friends, different ones around you. And eventually this thing's going to close in on you. But in the back of your head, you keep ignoring it. And this is what Jonah was doing. This is where we left him last week. We left him in a giant fish. It was an interesting tale. A whale of a tale. Okay, I'm done with puns for the rest of the day. But one of the things we learned, again, is you can run, but listen to me. High school students, college students, those of you that are even at different points in your life, even those that are older, you can run, but you can't run from God. Our God is relentless in the pursuit of His people. I think we realize that in this, He had His day of reckoning. But there's eventually a day, and you know this, that God, as a loving Father, is going to stop you in your tracks. And that's what Jonah discovered last week, is that there we see him. He's left in this fish, and he was going in the wrong direction. Not only was he kind of going in the wrong direction, but we know this on one side of it. He was going to Nineveh. God told him to go to Nineveh. Jonah said, And amazingly, he goes down to the docks and he finds a boat going to Tarshish. And he quickly falls on his knees and goes, God, this must be your will. There's a boat here going the opposite direction, missing the fact that Satan can provide a boat just like God can. And off he goes. He made the decision, maybe not so much by his words. In fact, he doesn't say a word, but by his action, he just says no. And again, the thing I want us to get this is I have and you have done this too. We've been reading in Scripture. We've been hearing maybe even a message that's preached. Some of you even last week, here's my thinking. You heard what I preached last week and you were convicted in one standpoint, but the moment that you got from here to your car, you totally disregarded God's word, and you know you were supposed to deal with some sin in your life. You were supposed to deal with some relationship in your life, but you decided to say, I'm not going to do it. You ran. We've all done it in different ways. And there he was, climbing on that boat. And as he climbed on that boat, he went in the absolute wrong direction. We find out that it wasn't smart. He went out onto the ocean, the place where God is the God of the seas. And not only did he go out on the ocean for a little bit of time, but he was taking the longest possible route in the largest known body of water, in trying to in some way think he was going to outrun this God. But unbeknownst to Jonah, God was about ready to introduce him to something very important. And that's what I want to talk about today. This is something that is so key for those of us that are runners. It is so key from the standpoint that by the time we get to chapter 2, I think not only did last week we talked about the anatomy of running away from God, but this week we're going to talk about kind of almost the anatomy of being restored to God. You're going to see this in chapter 2. When we finally are tired of running, when we finally hit the wall, when we finally end up in the fish, we're going to be introduced in a very cool way. And let me just put it this way. This isn't my term. I stole this from somebody who probably stole it from somebody who stole it from somebody. We're going to run into God's severe mercy. Now, in some ways, we don't like this when we kind of think about this idea of God being severe. But when our decisions have finally trapped us, we're going to now see God's grace in a powerful way. And not only that, we're going to see things more accurately. And I think the thing that we learn studying this particular section of Jonah 2 is that God is massively gracious. Just let me say that at the outset so nobody misses this. Today we sang about God's grace and we took the Lord's Supper talking about God's grace. But he will, now listen to me, if you check out the rest of the message, don't miss this. While he is gracious, he will go as far as it takes to bring us back to him. Our God will go as far as necessary. And let me just tell you this. You think you can go far, and I think I can go far, but we can't go far enough from God's severe grace that will eventually bring us back to him. So that's what we're going to focus on. This is what I think we're learning. And listen, it is a huge tension. We don't like it, but those of us that experience it, now just stop for a second. Those of us that have experienced God's severe grace, we know sometimes those are some of the most precious moments in my life. These moments where things get clear, these moments where I start to see things like I'm supposed to. These moments where I feel his discipline, not as retribution, but as God and his grace as a good dad bringing us back to him. So that's what I really want to get across to us, is that our God is gracious, but he will do whatever it takes to bring us back to him. Now, I think the flow of this particular story, let me just show this, is kind of like a plot summary. You know, as you learned about these in high school, these things kind of flow out, and this is the way it's going to go. In verses 1 through 2, we're going to learn this idea that God hears his running people in their distress. This is going to be Jonah's big statement. Whatever your distress in, whether you have had it happen to you or it's something you've done to yourself, he wants you to know this. God hears. But not only does God hear, he needs to start to talk about himself. This is the tension of what's created. He deals with his people using severe mercy. If you are a runner, you need to understand this. As a good dad, like our good dads do, he is going to show severe mercy. In verses 4 through 7, God is going to use the distress to help his running people gain clarity. Isn't it amazing? The moment you get trapped, you get really clear on what's important in life. And in verses 8 through 9, God uses the distress to restore his running people. And finally, God uses distress to prepare his running people so they can get engaged back in what God's calling them to do. So here's the first one. We're going to look at it. So let's just take a look at it. This is going to be verses 1 and 2. We're going to look at this first idea of how God prepares the runner, which is this: God hears his running people in their distress. Verse 1. Then, and I love this, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. Now, this particular prayer that we start to have here, it's a story meant to show us that what we're supposed to do when we get to this particular point. And I think for all of us in here, isn't it true that the first time in a long time, or maybe even the first time that we've ever cried out to God, is actually when we were finally stuck? It's the moment that we were busted. It's the moment when the teenager looks at that little stick from that pregnancy standpoint and realizes, oh no, I'm pregnant. It's that moment when you're caught in an inappropriate relationship and you have to tell your spouse. In other words, he's saying at this particular moment, suddenly my spiritual senses get heightened and all the other things around me are pointless to pursue. And all of a sudden I know my only out, my only satisfaction in this moment is going to be God himself. It's the classic, and I know you've done this before I have. God, if you get me out of this one, I swear I'll do whatever you ask me to do. Ever been there? I didn't think so. We can't do anything about it. We're completely caught in our shame. In an interesting and a powerful way, God's our only option. No matter how you have, in your weird way, reshaped God in your thinking or taken things out about God, what we learned about last week, why we run, we have to do that in order to be run. Suddenly your theology gets brought into a correct spot, and I see things correctly. I need God. It's amazing. All these slick ways that I learned how to not deal with God that I thought I could run, God in his grace was slowly hemming me in to the point where I realized I have no resources in and of myself. And one of the guys that I was reading this way put it this way. He said, we come to this place of circumstantial brokenness. Suddenly, our human wisdom, our little slick theology that we had, our resistance to God is just done. We're broken. We're broken. See, I think because we've so kind of written off Jonah as this caricature of this guy sitting down in this whale, as like a cartoon character going, oh no, I'm caught. We miss the fact that this was a real man. We've been in those spots of being busted before, those moments that we had nothing else to do. And in verse 2, finally we see him. He called out to the Lord out of my great distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. He uses this idea that I call out to the Lord out of my distress, or even out of the belly of Sheol, he said, I cried. And what was it that happened to him? What was it that was going on in this particular moment? Well, we find out that he's going to be in this particular beast for 3 days and 3 nights. And I started wondering this week, at what point did Jonah go, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Was it at the very end of those 3 days and 3 nights that he finally go, oh, I think this is kind of stupid? I seriously think that the moment that they grabbed Jonah and he's sitting there thinking, I'm going to get out, and he's flying through the air with his feet flailing, I think all of a sudden he went, God, never mind. I need you. Oh, I need you. Especially this hour, I need you. But he said, there's where I was. See, the thing about death is it tends to clear things up rather quickly, doesn't it? Everything makes sense. Now, I think he probably sat in there, that fish, for a long time, wrestling through this until he vomited him on his shore. But I think this was a 3-day, 3-night journey for him where he was learning who God is and who he is and what God called him to do. He probably in that moment thought, I need you, God. But by the day he comes around on day 3, the nighttime, the day, whenever he gets puked out, he realizes just how much he needs him. He learned this process that I think is very valuable, but God listens to people in their distress. I don't think we're distressed enough. Sometimes, and I've said this before, can you imagine if God pulled back for just a moment this realm that we live in and we could see the war that's going on all around us in the angelic realm, angels and demons, everything. Don't you believe that we would be people that cried out even more? But instead, we just start to coast. But our God listens, even when it's distress of our own making. He's gracious to us. But especially at this point, we see this in this text when he's broken. And no matter how far we've run, and I don't care how far any of you in here have run from God, our God listens to his people in distress.
He's talking also about Israel. God listens to his people in their distress. But he's also telling them a question. I am going to bring you to the point where you see no other way than my way. It is going to be severe. Watch this. Let me go this one. God deals with his running people using severe mercy. Look at verse 3. He says, you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. In other words, God in his grace was creating stress. Now, this is a little interesting. In chapter 1, we learn that the sailors threw him overboard, but look at this in chapter 2. You, God, cast me into the deep. In other words, remember what I said, you can run from God, you can run, but you can't run from God, is that God in that moment, while he's not the author of Jonah's sin, he's not the one that made him do it, as God is superintending in all of his grace and wisdom, he was also involved with Jonah ending up where he was going to end up. Our God was going to bring him to the point where he saw his severe mercy. He's not the author, but he's the one who makes this redemptive. But listen to me, God is always going to be severe in it. Now, this confronts our understanding at the core. Let me make sure I get this across to you. We tend to think that God is in our lives to make us safer, comfier, but we've missed this reality. In fact, some of us even came to Christ this way, and maybe even some of us think this way. But it is a naive view of God to think that God is in your life to make you safer or more comfy in this particular life. He's not. That's not the goal of God. Let me just make sure we understand the goal of God looking across the scope of Scripture. From the very beginning, he created us to be image bearers, to look like his son, Jesus Christ. And therefore, in order to get us to look more like Jesus, God is going to, in different ways, bring severe mercy into our lives, trials of all kinds of different kinds, to make sure that we are shaped and we're molded into the image of Jesus. Why? He does this because the problem is all of us in this room have gotten into the fish that we're in because we thought that we were the captain of our ship. We thought somehow that we were at the wheel, that we were driving this thing. There's a poem that probably everybody heard at every single graduation by a guy named William Ernest Henley. Let me just give you the lines. It's from the poem Invictus. And every time a kid reads this at graduation, I'm like, ugh. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. It sounds good, but it ain't true. God in his severe mercy is showing us that every time we grab that wheel, we drive the car into the ditch. In distress, however, we discover that seeking to be captain of the ship is exactly not only unwise, but it comes from this deep place of selfishness that somehow I think I'm the one that can define my life. I can define what I'm about and what I'm supposed to do. And God says, no, I don't play that game. I know why I've made you. I've made you for another. I've made you for me. I've made you to join me, to be engaged in this amazing thing that I'm doing on this planet. And every time you take the wheel, you begin to take yourself off away from me. And God is never afraid to throw us into a fish to bring us back, because in a cool way, he is deeply reshaping our lives. And I would say this, a lot of us in this room are probably experiencing it even right now. And let me tell you, on the other side of it, aren't we always thankful he does it? We come out completely different. He wants us to remember this. When I was a kid, I'll never forget this. I taught my brother what to do when somebody makes him mad, which I taught him at the time, it's to flip people off. Now, at the time, I thought it was a great idea to teach him how to do this. I said, look, if anybody makes you mad, this is what you do. And I didn't realize the first person that was going to make him mad was my mom. Came home from school that day, and my mom walks up to me and she put the finger in my face, not to say it, but do you know what this is? I played dumb. Well, you should, because you taught your brother how to do it when somebody gets angry, and he did it to me. You know those moments when everything just deflates? And I knew I was trapped when she said these words, wait till your father gets home. Those of you that are under 25 don't understand the fear of that statement. Growing up, man, mid-80s, what that meant is you were about ready to get a unique connection between you, your father, and his belt. I sat there the whole time in my own proverbial fish upstairs in their room, waiting for my father to come home. I was standing at the window on the second floor, and I finally saw his green truck come around the corner, and my heart began to race like it had never raced before. I hear him come in the door. I hear my mom go, and my dad go, uh-huh, uh-huh. And then the house we lived in had the creakiest steps ever. Creak, creak, creak. Turned around that door and I saw that knob turn. Dad came in, and my dad, you understand, man, if he's having a good day, he's like this. If he's having a bad day, he's like this. And he came in like this, and I knew it was a really bad day. Now, growing up, like I said, I did in the 70s and the 80s, and some of you, you're a little bit older, like the 1800s, but my dad always had this statement to me, and again, this was at this time, he would say to me, go get the belt. Now, what that was, man, in the 70s, I don't know if y'all remember the 70s, but they had like 12-prong belts, right? They were like this, and it's like, whoosh, 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 whoosh. And I walked over, but it was also a phenomenal transition for those of us that got spanked with a belt. They were also starting to wear those cloth belts. And so I went over, and what did I grab? The cloth belt, and I brought it back to him. I remember my dad taking the belt and saying this to me, Todd, if I use this, you'll never remember what you did. I'm going to use this because I want you to remember what you did. He started to tear up. He hugged me before he spanked me. I was like, no, I should Mom! I was just like, oh. And then he proceeded to spank me. Now, when I talk about this severe mercy, why does God do it? He doesn't want us to forget. He's not a vengeful God. He's not like us. And I think sometimes we've had I had a really good dad, but some of you have had bad dads that are abusive. So I'm not talking about a God that's vengeful. God is not trying in any way to pay you back. He's trying to get us inside of our heads to understand that there are certain ways that we go that he doesn't want us to go. And it's going to hurt a little bit because he doesn't want us to go back that direction. He wants us to understand deeply that that is a bad way to go. In an interesting way, Jonah got his little timeout. And in that moment, God was teaching him something about pain, God's severe mercy. But I don't want you to miss this, because this is what comes next. And this is, I think, what Jonah is trying to teach us in this moment. What he learned himself, because as he's writing this after, he's trying to teach the people of Israel. And I think, again, what he's trying to teach us is that God uses this distress, this severe mercy, to help his running people gain clarity. See, watching here. This is what Jonah says. He says, then I said, I'm driven away from your sight. The waters, he says in verse 5, closed in over my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me. When my life was fainting away, in other words, he wants him to get here that there's no hope of any other direction. All doors are closed. There's no way to run. There's no way to hide. I want you to feel like this is absolutely irreversible because it's so interesting. And again, we all know that we've got here before, that God's about ready to do some amazing work. God is not an eternal killjoy trying to destroy our fun. He knows that deep within us, every time we pursue those things that are outside of him, we wreck our lives. And he wants us not to go back there. Too often, man, we don't need God when things are going well. But at some point, Jonah starts to realize what I got is actually not what I wanted. When he was shipwrecked, when everything was going there, he started to realize, you know what, I think God is actually a better thing. We see this in those same verses in 2:4-6. I'm again going to look onto your holy temple. It's the grand place in which God interacts with his people. I'm going to look on this place of relationship. God, you've brought me to this point where I see the only thing I have is you. You brought up my life from the pit, O Lord, my God. I remembered the Lord. My prayer came into your holy temple, verse 7. In other words, what he's saying is that it was a scary experience, but it's amazing how in a scary experience, all the life stuff that's cluttered around me absolutely gets pushed out of the way. The stuff that's all around me doesn't matter. It's the best place I can be. It's paradoxical to think that way, but we learn that we're frail. We learn that we're finite. We learn that we are not all that we think we are, but we are also going to learn in the severe mercy of God, our God is a phenomenal Father. He'd forgotten all this. He forgot about the temple. He forgot about the relationship between God and his people. And notice something here. God didn't change his situation right away. He changed how Jonah saw the situation. You ever notice when we pray for people, we tend to pray what? God, please change their situation, change their circumstances. God doesn't work that way. God has so much bigger in mind than changing your circumstances. He wants to change us. He wants to make us people that are able to stand up in the midst of this life. And he didn't change then his circumstances. He changed how Jonah saw things. I would challenge you as people go through difficult times, whether it's their own making, just living in this world in which we live in that's fallen. Maybe they've chosen to follow Jesus and they've had experienced the difficulty in their life, or maybe even again, it's just something that somebody's done to somebody else. Don't necessarily start to pray for the change of their circumstances. Pray that God will begin to change their understanding and their perspective. Yeah, but you don't understand how bad Mrs. Smith's bunions hurt. I challenge you. God, before you heal Mrs. Smith's bunions, she's cranky, God. Would you make her see your grace so that she might be more softened? God, God, even in this way, before you change me, or before you change my circumstances, change me. Now, here's what he does. When runners run, God uses distress to restore his running people. My dad, after he would spank me, like I told you about, this is the one time he always would hug me before, but my dad would always spank me, and then my dad would pull me onto his lap, and he would just hug me. He would hug me tight, and he would grab my head in a unique way, back in the back of my head that I knew it was him, and he would whisper into my ear, never forget, I love you. God has Jonah right here. Jonah, never forget that I love you. Jonah, I'm doing this with a grander purpose in mind. You were running from me instead of to me. And when we run, Jonah says we always run to something, and look what he says we run to. He says, those who pay regard, look at this, to vain idols, forsake their hope of steadfast love, but I with the voice of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you what I have vowed. I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. He says, listen to me. Every time you run away from God, you're actually running to these things that are called vain idols. You're running towards these things that you think you want. In the back of your head, you think you want to be out of your marriage, so you run out of your marriage. You think that you want to go have fun before you become a college student. You think all these different things that you want to be, but God is sitting there saying, and Jonah has learned, every time that we run from God, we're running to vain idols. And the Bible is clear on this, that once we get out there, our idols do not hear our prayer. I think it's interesting, and you can't see this very well, but it's the greatest, what is that? The greatest showman. Watch that with my kids. The whole point of the story of Barnum is that he wanted prestige. But have you ever noticed when you're finding that trap, you don't go, oh, prestige, help me. What is prestige going to do? Or even those moments where you're sitting there like we shouldn't be doing, and we're looking at maybe porn, we're pursuing after these sexual kind of things, thinking, oh my gosh, I just want to have my sexual appetites fulfilled. But the moment everything hits, we don't pray to our sexual appetites. I think it's interesting that we think relationships are going to make us happy. Those of you that have been married maybe over 20 years, you know that when you first got married, we said to each other, why do we want to get married? And we say, oh, because we love each other. Yeah, you don't know love yet. You are marrying each other because you are starting to learn to love each other. But then when that other spouse does not fulfill whatever it is that spouse thinks to be fulfilled, it all falls down around them. They didn't get what they wanted. And even as hard as they do, they try to cry out in some weird way to that vain idol of relationship, but it's not there. Others, it's money. I think right now in our culture, in our society, everybody's happy again, that money is flowing and everything's good. And we have safety and comfort and security. And I promise you, God in his severe mercy is not afraid to go, let me take that away. And we can cry out to the God of money all we want. 401k, save me. Job, save me. Economy, save me. Trump, save me. Only to find out they're not there. The only one that is there, Jonah learns, is God, Yahweh. Everything has been stripped away. See, this is why God's not afraid to do this. He's not afraid one by one to take all these idols out of our life so that at the very end of it, we see what is most beautiful and most important, the thing that actually is steadfast, this God, this Yahweh, the King of the universe, the one that is God over dry land and sea. This one right here, when everything falls apart, that's who you can cry out to. And that's where Jonah finally says, this is what I've learned in all this. I've learned that my relationship with God is the only thing that is true and sure in this world. Now at this point, now God says, okay, now we're ready. I don't know if it was day 1. I don't know if it was day 2. I don't know if it was day 3. But somewhere in there, this started to happen. God will allow us to stay in a fish for a very long time to get the point. Israel was in captivity, in exile, for 70 years. I think by year 1, they got it. But God was like, no, I want you to really get this so that you can be the people I've called you to be. We see it in verse 10, and the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out over the dry land. Now watch this. I love this part. You're supposed to laugh, by the way. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Jonah, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Yes, sir. God had him right where he wanted him. They restored relationship. And now in that weird moment, that this thing that happens between us and God, Jonah was willing to do whatever God called him to do. Now, I think what's interesting in this, and don't miss this, over the next few weeks, what we're going to learn is that Jonah still didn't get it. Jonah in that moment thought, oh, I get it, God, I totally am with you. Totally, I will never, ever be an idiot again. God, I swear I won't. Have we ever said that before? God, I will never go do that again. I won't do that again. I won't drink again. I won't smoke again. I won't chew again. I won't date girls that do again. I won't do any of these particular. God, I swear I will never go down this path again. But God is interesting. He knows there's more to teach us. Now, here's what I want to do this morning. I want to give you some moments just to yourself. Part of it is just to ask yourself the question, how am I running? That's what we asked last week. But the second part of it is do you want to bend your knee to this God and quit running? Now, I'm not talking just in anything. Oftentimes we'll hand God things that we really want to do. Father, if you want me to be a millionaire, I will go ahead and do it. I will submit to your will. I can totally understand that this is what you want me to do. Here I am, send me. I want you to ask the Holy Spirit to search you for those things that you're resisting God on. Maybe it's between you and your spouse. Maybe it's these things that you've been doing at work or at the gym. Maybe you're just stubbornly right now that you are totally saying, I'm going to work against this guy. I don't have time for him. I will do it later. Maybe that's the thing right now that God is confronting you on and asking you to bend your knee. I want you just to take the next few moments. Please, my huge concern is that all of you will hear me this morning, and by the time you get from here to your car, you will think this is not about you. This is about me, and this is about you. This is what Jonah, the book of Jonah, is trying to tell us. This is about us. So in the next few moments, ask God. God, just between you and I, what are those things that I'm running from you on? Even in those moments that you're with God, confess it to him. Tell God that you know you're wrong. I had to do this with a couple of things in my life this week that God has just worked me over on. God, please forgive me. I have been running from you in these areas of my life. And pray out to him, God, man, I don't want to run anymore. Confess those moments that you're scared of it, though. Confess those moments of your fear to go down these particular paths of going wherever God's called you to do. Maybe for some of you, like I said, you've never chosen to follow Jesus, and today you're sitting there going, man, if I go down that path seems scary because I don't know this God. Confess that to God and ask him, God, would you empower me to have the strength and the capacity to begin to go down this path and then willfully choose to join him and go down that path, whatever that path might be. Maybe for some of you, you need to confess sin to a spouse because you know that you've been sinning. Some of you need to go to work and you need to confess sin. In your head, you're thinking, oh, I don't want to go do that because I'm going to lose face. I'm going to look different. I'm going to look odd. People are going to look down on me. There's all these excuses that we're going to make that we're going to rearrange God or take something out about God not to do it. And I think right now there's this beautiful moment of this God, like I said, who is gracious and loving and long-suffering, that adores us like a great, great father. We can come to him right now. And those of us that know Jesus, we know he forgives sin. Please, don't leave today without bending the knee and stopping your running. Because if you are a child of God, let's just be honest. You can run, but you can't outrun God. And I think there's no better moment than this moment right now for you to deal with that reality between you and God. So the next few minutes are yours. Jared and Mary Beth will come up in just a second, and we'll sing after that. If you need prayer over here afterwards, love to pray for you. If you need maybe someone to explain to you about this Jesus that we've been talking about, we'd love to talk to you about him. But please don't leave today without dealing with what you need to deal with.